Module 16, Chapter 22, Your Respiratory System. Your respiratory system carries on many functions. For example, it's involved in gas exchange. This is the site where you are going to exchange oxygen between air and blood and carbon dioxide between blood and air. It's used for communication, such as speaking and other types of vocalization. It is where you have your olfaction or your sense of smell. Your lungs are important in maintaining your acid-base balance. You will learn in this chapter that losing carbon dioxide gas actually helps to control the pH of your blood, and by controlling blood pH, you control the pH of your other body fluids. It's involved in blood pressure regulation. Recall from lecture exam 2 that your lungs are responsible for producing angiotensin converting enzyme, which is needed to change angiotensin 1 into the active angiotensin 2. Your respiratory system is important for both the flow of blood and lymph throughout the body. You'll learn in this chapter that respiration creates pressure gradients between your thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities, and that these gradients are going to help to promote blood and lymph flow. Your lungs do a little bit of blood filtration. For the most part, what they do is they can filter out very small blood clots and dissolve them, which is going to help prevent those small little clots from blocking blood flow into another body organ. The respiratory system is also used for the expulsion of abdominal contents. For example, holding your breath is used to help expel your contents during urination, defecation, and childbirth. Your respiratory system can be organized two different ways. It can be organized based on anatomical structures, or it can be organized based on the physiology, the function of those structures. If you think about your anatomical organization, you can break your respiratory tract down into an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. Now, you might have at some point had a doctor refer to you as having an upper respiratory tract infection or a lower respiratory tract infection. Those designations are based on what structure is actually infected. Now, the upper respiratory tract begins at the nostril, which is the opening that moves air between your environment and your respiratory system. And it includes the internal chambers called the nasal cavity and the pharynx. The nickname for the pharynx is sometimes the throat. So if you have an upper respiratory tract infection, your infection is within the nasal cavity and its associated paranasal sinuses and your pharynx. The lower respiratory tract begins at the larynx, which is connected to the pharynx, and includes not just the larynx, but also your trachea, your bronchi, your bronchioles, your alveolar ducts, and your alveoli. So basically, the dividing line anatomically between the upper and lower respiratory tract is at the border between the pharynx and larynx. From the pharynx up, you are in the upper. From the larynx down, you are in the lower. Now, if you think functionally, you can divide your entire respiratory system into a conducting division and a respiratory division. Now, if you look at the conducting division, you're dealing with all of the interconnecting cavities and tubes outside and inside the lungs. So the conducting division is going to begin with the nostril, which is where you're exchanging air between the respiratory system and the environment. From the nostril, it includes the nasal cavity, the pharynx, larynx, trachea, the bronchi, which are your cartilaginous airways coming off the trachea, the bronchioles, which are the muscular airways coming off of the bronchi, and all of the bronchioles as they get smaller and smaller and smaller, up to and including the terminal bronchioles. Now, the terminal bronchioles are the last muscular bronchioles. So from nostril to terminal bronchiole, you are conducting division. Now, with regards to function, if you think about what it means to conduct, conduct means to move things. So this division is responsible for just crudely moving air in and out of your lungs. However, that's not all it does. It also is responsible for regulating the temperature and humidity of your incoming and outgoing air. Now, let's just think about the air coming in. The air coming in to your body can be fairly dry. Yes, I know here in Florida we have high humidity, but it's not 100% saturated with water. The air coming in also is not at homeostatic body temperature. Now, think about your lungs, the destination of that air. Your lungs need to stay at homeostatic temperature. And if you flood them with air that's cooler, your lungs are going to start to get cooler, and they're going to start acting like two giant chillers inside your chest, which could lower the temperature of your other vital organs, in particular the heart, which is lying in between them. Also, your gas exchange within the lungs is going to occur by diffusion. And you learned in A&P 1 that diffusion occurs best through water, through watery interfaces inside the body. So you want to make sure that the air coming into your lungs, one, is not going to cool your lungs down out of homeostasis, and two, be 100% saturated with water to provide the best possible diffusion. So what your conducting division is going to do is it's going to add two things to your incoming air. It's going to add heat. So basically your air, as it's passing through all of these structures, is going to be heated up to homeostatic body temperature, making sure your lungs stay at homeostasis. They're also going to add a lot of moisture to your air so that when the air gets into the lungs, it's nice and wet. It's very humid. And that humid air is going to provide the best possible rate of diffusion inside the lungs, which is awesome. However, when you exhale, all of that nice, hot, moist air is going to leave the body, which means exhaling puts you at risk for one, the loss of vital heat. So it could throw off your internal body temperature just by losing heat. Also, it could cause dehydration if you're exhaling all of that water. So what these tubes will do as you exhale is that they can reclaim a good bit of that heat, and they can also reclaim a good bit of that water. So they help to prevent heat loss and dehydration as the air is flowing out. Your other functional division is called the respiratory division, and as the name implies, these are your tissues for gas exchange. Now, the respiratory division begins at the end of a terminal bronchiole, because at the end of a terminal bronchiole, you have a structure called a respiratory bronchiole. And as the name implies, these bronchioles can actually do respiration. They can do gas exchange. Their walls are thin enough. The reason their walls are thin enough is that respiratory bronchioles lack smooth muscle in their wall, unlike the terminal bronchiole, which still does have muscle. By making the respiratory bronchiole wall thinner, you actually can facilitate gas exchange. So from the respiratory bronchioles, where we're starting to do a little gas exchange, air is going to flow into more numerous alveolar ducts, which also can do gas exchange. And from these alveolar ducts, your air is going to flow into your alveoli, which are your primary sites of gas exchange. Now, it's estimated that you have within your lungs about 300 million alveoli, providing an average surface area of about 70 square meters, which is equal to about 750 square feet. This is about the size of a racquetball court. So you have an immense surface area thanks to these alveoli for gas exchange. And recall from A&P 1 that the greater your surface area, the greater your rate of diffusion can be. So all of that surface created by these little alveoli provides you with an adequate rate of gas exchange. Now, surrounding each lung is a pleural cavity. The pleural cavity is described as a potential space. So that means it's not a space if you actually look in someone's healthy thoracic cavity, but you have the potential to form a space. And this potential space encloses and protects each lung. So that means you're in a human body, you have two pleural cavities, one around the right lung, one around the left lung. Now, each pleural cavity is lined by what is called a pleural membrane. The pleural membrane is also called the pleura. Now, this pleural membrane has two layers to it. You have a parietal pleura, which is going to cover the inner surface of your thoracic wall. It also lines the surface of the diaphragm, and it is next to the mediastinum. You then have the visceral pleura, which is physically attached to the surface of the lung, and it extends into the fissures between the lung lobes. Now, between the parietal and visceral pleura, this is where you actually have the cavity. And within the cavity, you do have a very thin layer of fluid called pleural fluid. Now, this fluid is going to help to reduce friction while you breathe. So as the parietal pleura and visceral pleura slide past each other during respiration, this fluid is going to reduce friction, which could potentially create inflammation. Now, the two pleura and your pleural fluid are going to be involved with the creation of the pressure gradients that have a role in expanding your lungs during inhalation. So we're going to be using these structures as we breathe. Also, this organization, by having two separate pleural cavities, you provide what is called compartmentalization, which means you can prevent the spread of infection by having your lungs isolated not just from each other, but from the pericardium and from the rest of the mediastinum. So by having your thoracic cavity broken down into all of these internal compartments, you prevent infections from spreading easily. Now, there are three types of respiration that occur in the human body. Two we're going to focus on in this chapter. The third you were introduced to in A&P 1 when we talked about ATP production in muscle. One type of respiration you'll deal with in this chapter is called alveolar gas exchange. Now, alveolar gas exchange occurs across something called the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is composed of the simple squamous epithelium composing the alveolar wall and the simple squamous epithelium of the pulmonary capillary wall. Now, between these two epithelia is an extremely thin basement membrane. So your respiratory membrane is made out of the thinnest tissue in the human body, again providing for the most rapid gas exchange. Now, the purpose of alveolar gas exchange is to exchange gases between the air in your alveoli and the blood in your pulmonary capillaries. And the main purpose is to move oxygen from your air into your blood and to move carbon dioxide gas from blood and into air. You'll also be learning in this chapter about systemic gas exchange. Systemic gas exchange involves the exchange of gases between the blood in your systemic capillaries and your other body tissues. Now, the main purposes are to move oxygen from blood and into your interstitial fluid, because from your interstitial fluid, oxygen can then enter your body cells. You're then going to move carbon dioxide gas from your interstitial fluid, where it has accumulated from your body cells, and move it from your interstitial fluid into your blood for transport to the lungs. The third type of respiration is called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration involves all of the reactions within your cells that, as they consume oxygen to make ATP, and as they consume the oxygen and produce ATP, release carbon dioxide gas as a waste. Now, abnormalities can occur if respiration does not work properly. For example, you could develop hypoxia. Hypoxia is low tissue oxygen. So that means your smooth muscle, your skeletal muscle, your adipose tissue, you name your favorite tissue, and it's got below homeostatic oxygen. Now, low tissue oxygen will severely limit your metabolic activity. Now, hypoxia is different from hypoxemia. Hypoxemia is low blood oxygen. So in this chapter, and as you go forward in your study of A&P, these two terms have different meanings. So if you hear hypoxemia, you think low blood oxygen. If you hear hypoxia, you are looking at low oxygen in various organs throughout the body. Now, anoxia, remember an A at the beginning of any biological term means it's absent. In anoxia, you have no oxygen within that tissue. And this particular situation will start to kill your cells quickly. Without oxygen, you can't produce the ATP you need to survive. Now, pulmonary ventilation is what you call breathing. This is bringing air from your environment into your lungs and then exhaling air from the lungs and into your environment. And the ability to breathe, to have this pulmonary ventilation occur normally, is important because pulmonary ventilation maintains adequate alveolar ventilation. Alveolar ventilation is the movement of air in and out of your alveoli. And this alveolar ventilation is going to help prevent carbon dioxide buildup within the alveoli and ensure a constant oxygen supply to the alveoli, which is essential for your blood to then carry the correct amount of O2. Now, when you start thinking about pulmonary ventilation, you're going to start hearing this term respiratory cycle. A respiratory cycle consists of one inspiration, which is also referred to as inhalation, followed by one expiration, which is also referred to as exhalation. So it's basically one in and one out as you breathe. Now, quiet respiration, which is also called eupnea, is your relaxed, unconscious, automatic breathing. So hopefully this is what you're doing right now as you're listening to this recording and taking notes. However, there are times when you need to breathe greater volumes of air, and that's when you bring in what is referred to as forced respiration or hypernia. Forced respiration is unusually deep or rapid breathing, such as would occur during exercise or singing, playing musical instruments, coughing, sneezing, etc. Now, respiration depends on what is called atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is the weight of environmental air on our bodies. So this is external air pressing down on us. And at sea level, atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Now, this is a number you need to remember. Okay? This particular chapter involves some numbers. Now, we're going to use 760 millimeters of mercury throughout this entire chapter, but know that if you go to extremely high elevations, such as Breckenridge, Colorado, which is over 9,000 feet above sea level, atmospheric pressure does decline, which is why you get things like altitude sickness because of how this lower atmospheric pressure affects your ability to gas exchange. But we're going to be sticking with sea level pressure because that's what most people around the country are subjected to. Now, because atmospheric pressure is our constant, okay, what's on the outside of us is always 760, the ability to move air is going to depend on pressure changes within the thoracic cavity, because air loves to move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So to bring air into the lungs, you're going to have to make the lungs a lower pressure than the outside world, so that air goes from the outside to the inside. In order to exhale, what's in the lungs has to become a higher pressure than the outside world, so that air goes from the high on the inside to the low on the outside. Now, in thinking about this movement of air from high to low pressure, we bring up the first of the gas laws that you're going to be learning this semester, which is something called Boyle's Law. Now, in Boyle's Law, the pressure of a gas varies inversely with its volume. So the word inverse means opposite. So as long as the number of your gas molecules remains constant, if you decrease the size of your container, you will increase the pressure of the gas within that container. Likewise, if you increase the size of your container, you will decrease the gas pressure within that container. Now, inspiration and expiration change the size of your containers. They're going to change your lung volumes. So any change in that volume is going to change the pressure within the lungs. Now, inspiration increases lung size. So according to Boyle's law, increasing lung size will result in a decrease in gas pressure. So increasing lung size decreases the gas pressure within the lung. Expiration decreases lung size. So if your lung size goes down while you exhale, you're going to have an increase in the gas pressure within the lungs. Now, these increases and decreases are what create the pressure gradients responsible for your air movement. So, why does this occur during your respiratory cycle? Well, think about it. If you put your hand on your chest and take a breath in, so inhale, you can feel as you inhale that your thoracic cavity is getting larger. So that means your thoracic wall is moving outward. Now, you learned about the parietal pleura a few slides ago. You learned that the parietal pleura is attached to the inside surface of your thoracic cavity. So as your thoracic wall moves outward, the parietal pleura is pulled outward too. Now, that pleural fluid that you have between your parietal and visceral pleura creates a little bit of surface tension. And the surface tension holds the parietal and visceral pleura together. So now follow the train of thought. Your thoracic wall moves outward as you inhale. The parietal pleura, as a result, is pulled outward too. The surface tension created by your pleural fluid then pulls the visceral pleura outward also. Now, the visceral pleura is attached to the surface of the lungs. So if you pull the visceral pleura outward, wouldn't you then be pulling the lungs outward, stretching them, expanding them, and making those containers bigger? Now, when you exhale, you have the complete opposite changes because the thoracic cavity is going to get smaller. When you exhale, you can feel your ribs and sternum move inward. So the thoracic wall moves in. If the thoracic wall moves in, the parietal pleura moves inward, which allows the visceral pleura to move inward, which is going to help make those lungs smaller, make those cavities smaller. Now, it's the physical changes to the thoracic wall, to your thoracic cavity as a whole, that are going to create the pressure changes. And there are two major muscle groups involved in your quiet respiration. One is the diaphragm, and the other are your external intercostal muscles that are between the ribs. Now, imagine you are at the beginning of a respiratory cycle, so it's just prior to inhale. Now, just prior to inhale, your diaphragm and your external intercostal muscles are relaxed. Now, the diaphragm, when it is relaxed, has a dome shape, and the dome is pushing up into your thoracic cavity. Now, when you inhale, these two muscle groups are going to contract. Now, the diaphragm, when it contracts, it is going to flatten. And when it flattens, it pushes downward on the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, that means that as it is pushing down on the abdominopelvic cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity is getting smaller, but the thoracic cavity is getting bigger. And as the thoracic cavity is getting bigger, those lungs are being pulled outward and they're expanding. Now, also, while you are inhaling, your external intercostal muscles contract. Primarily, these are the muscles that are going to contract. And when they contract, they elevate your ribs and sternum, meaning they're going to lift these structures upward and push them outward, which is also going to contribute to an increase in the size of your thoracic cavity, contributing to the stretching of those lungs. Now, when you exhale, these muscles all relax. So the diaphragm is going to relax and it's going to push upward into the thoracic cavity as it regains its dome shape. As it pushes upward, it makes the thoracic cavity smaller, which helps to make your lungs smaller. When the external intercostal muscles relax, they depress the ribs and sternum, meaning the ribs and sternum are going to move inferiorly, they're going to move downward and inward, which is also going to make your thoracic cavity smaller. Now, you can't see these muscles contracting and relaxing, but you can feel the changes to your thoracic cavity if you put your hand on your sternum and just inhale and exhale. And you can experience those physical external changes. So clearly, inspiration and expiration change the volumes of your lungs. This is going to allow you to change the air pressure within the lungs themselves. Now, when you start thinking about the pressure of air within the lungs, there are two different pressures that are at play. One pressure is called intrapleural pressure. This is gas pressure in the pleural cavity. So this is a pressure that is surrounding the lung, not within the lung. Now, this pressure, its main purpose with regards to how we discuss it is to help keep your lungs partially inflated even with an exhale. So it's going to form what they call a negative pressure, a little bit of a suction that's going to keep your lungs partially inflated. Now, intrapleural pressure prior to an inhale is measured at -5 centimeters of water. Now that minus means that this pressure is 5 centimeters of water below atmosphere. Now, you might be wondering why I said atmospheric pressure was in millimeters of mercury, but now I'm using centimeters of water. The pressure changes that you have within the lungs are too small to be measured in millimeters of mercury. So the actual gas pressure differences are measured with centimeters of water instead. That being said, -5 centimeters of water is still less than 760 millimeters of mercury. The other pressure that we're going to be talking about is called intrapulmonary pressure. This is the pressure of air within the alveoli themselves, and this is the pressure that's going to drive air movement in and out of the lungs. All right, so now let's talk about how your pressures are changing during a respiratory cycle. So we're going to pose a scenario where we are just prior to an inspiration. Okay, so we are just before a respiratory cycle. Just prior to inspiration, your intrapleural pressure is -5 centimeters of water. Your intrapulmonary pressure inside the alveoli is actually equal to atmosphere. So your alveolar air is sitting at 760 millimeters of mercury, which is equal to the air outside the body, meaning just prior to that inhale, air is not moving between respiratory tract and air. Now let's begin our cycle. We're going to take a breath in. Now, while we are breathing in, remember our containers are getting bigger, meaning our intrapleural pressure decreases from -5 centimeters of water to -8 centimeters of water. So we're going to have a decrease in our intrapleural pressure. Now, this decline in pressure has a really important effect that you actually had to learn for lecture exam number 2. Do you remember that little respiratory pump, that change in thoracic cavity pressure that helped you to return venous blood into the thoracic cavity and pull lymph into the thoracic cavity during inhale? This is the pressure change that actually runs your respiratory pump. So this decline from -5 to -8 centimeters of water is pulling blood from the abdominopelvic cavity into the thoracic cavity, and it's pulling lymph into those thoracic ducts, the thoracic duct and your right lymphatic duct. Now, as you are inhaling, your intrapulmonary pressure changes as well. So the pressure of gas in your alveoli changes, and it's going to decrease to -1 centimeters of water. Now I know that that's a really small change, but it's still a decrease, and it's going to make the pressure inside your alveoli less than the air outside the body, which is going to create that pressure gradient you need to move air from the environment and into your alveoli. So we're going to have air flowing in. Now, in addition to Boyle's law helping you to bring air in during inhale, you also have Charles's law at play as well. Charles's law states that the volume of a given quantity of gas is directly proportional to its absolute temperature. So remember, while you are inhaling, your conducting division is adding heat to your air. And as that heat is added, the gas starts to expand. So that nice hot air entering your alveoli is expanding as its temperature is increasing, which also helps to inflate your lungs. All right, so now we have inhaled, and have you ever noticed that when you're just sitting and breathing, when you inhale, there's actually an end to it? Like at some point, the air stops flowing in. And that's where we are right now with our discussion. We have reached the end of our inspiration, but we have not started exhaling yet. So we are just prior to expiration. And at this point, your intrapleural pressure is that -8 centimeters of water. However, your intrapulmonary pressure is back to atmosphere. You have inhaled enough air to increase the pressure in your alveoli back to 760 millimeters of mercury, which is why airflow stops. Once your in is equal to your out, air is not going to flow. All right, now we begin our exhale. Remember, as we're exhaling, our muscles are relaxing, the thoracic cavity is getting smaller, and that's going to increase our pressure. So your intrapleural pressure is going to increase back to -5 centimeters of water. Now this increase in pressure is what's going to help to push your venous blood from the veni cava into the right atrium and help to push lymph from your right lymphatic and thoracic ducts into your blood at the subclavian veins. Your intrapulmonary pressure also increases. Remember, we were at 760 millimeters of mercury, and now we have made those containers smaller, and your pressure increases to +1 centimeters of water. The positive means that your pressure has increased above atmosphere. Now it's a really small increase, but an increase is an increase. And now you have an area of high inside the alveoli, an area of low outside the body, and air naturally wants to flow out. And the air is going to flow out until you equalize your pressure again, meaning the alveoli drop down to 760, your air 760, and we are now back to B in your notes, where we are just prior to an inspiration and we're ready to begin another cycle. Now, if you forcefully breathe, you're just going to create greater pressure gradients. So you're going to make greater degrees of change in your intrapulmonary pressure, which is going to just allow greater volumes of air to move. Now, before ending this segment, I just want to talk a little bit about your respiratory muscles. And we have mentioned two. During quiet inspiration, we have your diaphragm, which is actually responsible for about 2/3 of the airflow during inspiration. So about 75% of the air that you inhale with quiet inspiration is just due to diaphragm. The external and internal intercostal muscles do both play a role with quiet breathing. Together, these two groups of muscles do help to stiffen the rib cage and prevent it from caving inward while you are decreasing the pressure within it. However, the external intercostals then also have the ability to elevate the ribs and push the sternum forward, which is going to help you move the other 1/3 of your quiet breathing volume. So they're responsible for about 25% of your airflow. Now, quiet expiration is a completely passive process. It is due to the elastic recoil of all of your stretched tissues. So it's the elastic recoil of the muscles when they relax. It's also due to the elastic recoil of the elastic fibers within your alveolar walls. So your lungs are very, very elastic. And when those elastic fibers stretch with inspiration, they're going to recoil and help make those lungs smaller with expiration. Now, if you go to do forced breathing, whether it's inhaling or exhaling, is going to require extra muscles. So with forced inspiration, you tie in the erector spinae, which are the main muscles, the very deep ones in your back that are responsible for posture. When those muscles contract with forced inspiration, they arch your back, which helps to increase your thoracic cavity diameter. You can contract the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, the pectoralis minor and major, your serratus anterior, and the intercartilaginous part of your internal intercostals. The intercartilaginous part is the portion of the muscle between the costal cartilages. Contracting all of these muscles actually give extra lift to the ribs and sternum, so it makes your thoracic cavity even larger. During forced expiration, we can use the rectus abdominis to help pull down on the ribs and sternum, making the thoracic cavity smaller. The interosseous part of the internal intercostals, so this is the portion of those muscles between the ribs themselves, this portion pulls down on the ribs, making your thoracic cavity smaller. You can even use muscles within the lumbar, abdominal, and pelvic regions. These muscle groups will, when they contract with force, they actually push your abdominal organs up, and when they push up on the diaphragm, meaning the diaphragm pushes even further into the thoracic cavity, making its volume smaller.